to everybody. First, I'd like to express my gratitude to Dr. Still, who I'm sure looks over all of our shoulders more often than we'd like to think. Also, thank you to our president, Dr. Phelps, our ATSU board, and Dean Wilson for allowing us to have a concurrent CME for Founders Day, which somewhere along the line was granted the chairs the ability to invite the tinning presenters. And you know, this little flyer that you all have that has the program today. It talks a little bit about the history of the Tinning Founders Day Osteopathic Lecture, which in 2009, Fred Tinning, PhD, and his wife Janet created an endowment for A.T. Still University, KCOM, that would provide the annual lecture on osteopathy during Founders Day. Dr. and Mrs. Tinning established the Fred C. Tinning, PhD, President Emeritus Founders Day Osteopathy Lecture Endowment because of their strong belief in perpetuating the importance of osteopathic practice and principles. The purpose of the Tinning Endowment, it allows the perpetual source of income to allow this to continue on. And I'll let you read the rest of it, but we are very appreciative of Dr. Tinning, and he approves of every Founders Day lecture, so we have to run it past him. And you know, this year actually we have a returning champion to Founders Day as a Tinning lecturer. But you know, at this moment, I'd like to welcome you students and our to another ATSU KCOM tradition of participating in the event through the Tinning presenter to be able to present or to participate in this Founders Day is this very special thing, and I hope that you're able to appreciate it. And I'm very excited to introduce you to one of my mentors, but I'm going to get to that. Also, I'd like to recognize and welcome back our alumni and our conference CME attendees. And I want to take this moment to invite all of our students to come back to the Heartland for future Founders Days after you graduate, and you will graduate. So sometimes you probably worry about that. So there will always be more to learn about, and Founders Day events are both CME opportunities and a homecoming for you. So I want you to know that medical school, and I've said this before, is a love-hate relationship. And after you get done, you want to foster those loving memories more, because you can appreciate it more as you move on to the next stage. For me, today is a landmark moment in my career as an osteopathic medical educator, because I have the pleasure of introducing you to one of my great mentors in osteopathy, Dr. Robert Ward. As a student, I used to
drive me nuts.
Drive him nuts, yes. I still do, so it's okay. But I used to spend time during the summer, a couple days a week actually, in Dr. Ward's clinic, shadowing him. And you know, you guys have all shadowed. You know, it's like, I know you have because I was interviewed a lot of you. But that was, you know, I mean, I was a first generation medical student. I had no idea what I had to do really. But I got into the medical school somehow. You know, got to hang out with people like Dr. Ward, made it through, and here I am teaching to you, which is really exciting. But I had that opportunity, and I know today that I wouldn't be the clinician I am if I hadn't had that opportunity. And what I've learned from Dr. Ward, from being there and being shadowing in his clinic and watching him up on stage, you know, I appreciate more and more every day. And when I go through and teach to you, and I know the things you say about me, for better or for worse, because, you know, we said the same thing about Dr. Ward.
Goes with
better
the territory.
or for worse. And I can appreciate now the struggles that he was facing then, and the challenges of teaching, and it's just very exciting to be here and to continue to work on that craft of teaching and osteopathic education. There is an event at 4 p.m. today called the Evening of the Stars in the Blumenthal Lab that students are invited to attend and observe physician mentors like Dr. Ward, and Dr. Ward's going to be there. I'll be there. Other people are going to be there. It's going to be a lot of people. Our conference attendees are going to be there. So you can go basically off the reservation and be learning on the reservation, because of all these resources that we're going to have here. So I'm encouraging you to attend, because you never know what you might learn, who you might learn from, and where that might lead. So, you know, Dr. Ward, I'll tell you, he put on a myofascial release 40-hour conference in my first year, right before I spent time with him. I asked him at that conference, can I spend time with you? He says, I guess so. So, and I actually invited like the State Journal reporter to come and, you know, with our Michigan State University newspaper to come and do an article. And Dr. Ward was like, Jay, why did you do that? I'm like, Dr. Ward, this is like exciting. I want people to know about osteopathic medicine. He says, Jay, I'm just doing my job here. And so, you know, in this thing, it says, you know, I've got like a whole page of like Dr. Ward's accomplishments. This is the short version, okay? This is not, and he gets embarrassed, but I'm still gonna read it. So, all right, so Robert Ward.
No, you don't need to read that. They got it.
I'm reading it, Dr. Ward. I don't, you can't stop me. A 1957 graduate of Kansas City College of Osteopathic Medicine, is celebrated as a world-renowned physician and educator in osteopathic medicine. He has been honored numerous times as one of the many of the top 30 osteopathic pioneers recognized for his significant contributions to the profession. Included among Dr. Ward's contributions to the osteopathic profession is his service as the executive editor of the first and second editions of the AOA, American Osteopathic Association's textbook, Foundations for Osteopathic Medicine. He received numerous achievement awards, including the American Academy of Osteopathy's ATSU Medallion of Honor. That thing's pretty heavy, right? Yeah, it's pretty heavy. I know it.
I didn't get a hernia.
Yeah, he's like, oh, no, it's a heavy metal. Heavy metal. All right. AOA's Max Hutchinson Clinic and the AOA's Lifetime Achievement Award. Michigan State University, with more than 150-year history of faculty contributions to review, honored Dr. Ward as one of the initial 130 members to have made the university's mission, to have made historic contributions to the university and significant career contributions to the university's mission to serve both the people of the state of Michigan and the international community. His research contributions are numerous, but of special note is his 13 years of service as the principal investigator exploring osteopathic principles in education, sponsored by the Education Council on Osteopathic Medicine and the American Association of Colleges of Osteopathic Medicine. Additionally, he served as the first osteopathic grant reviewer for the National Institute of Health, National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health. Dr. Ward also served as chair of the AAO's research committee. Dr. Ward has been board certified by both the American College of Osteopathic Family Physicians and the American Osteopathic Board of Neuromusculoskeletal Medicine. Before joining MSU College of Osteopathic Medicine faculty as professor and founding chair of the Department of Family Medicine, he was in private practice for 15 years in Mount Clemens, Michigan. Dr. Ward was co-founder and founding program director for MSU College of Osteopathic Medicine's Neuromusculoskeletal Medicine residency program. He has served as an expert consultant on the standards of osteopathic practice in both the private and public sectors, including primary care, substance abuse, and osteopathic manipulative treatment. He has served as president of the North American Academy of Musculoskeletal Medicine. Dr. Ward currently serves as professor emeritus at MSU College of Osteopathic Medicine. It is my great pleasure and privilege to introduce to you one of my great mentors, Dr. Robert Ward. Thank you.
Good job. Good job. Hello, everybody. I didn't believe who that person was that he was describing. When I hear what people say about the things that I've done, I never thought about it very much, because when you go about your daily business, you don't realize what the long-term impact will be. And today, we're talking about issues that have great impact on everyone in this room, and for you kids in the profession, you first years, you're going to live a very different life than the rest of us, and we don't know what it's going to be. And one of my favorite one of my favorite terms is living with ambiguity. And if you're not prepared to live with ambiguity, you're probably in the wrong school. Because when you get out there in the big wide world, you're going to be continuously confronted with ambiguity. And that is the issue that my generation, which is 2 generations ahead of you, by the way, not just 1 generation, we're 2 generations ahead of you, and to think about your life in terms of ambiguity. And I told the people this morning, which was, I just loved that, and I went home and slept for an hour, by the way, afterwards. You guys drained me. But one of the things that I wanted to talk about is how do we cope with ambiguity. And as I get into the meat and substance of what I want to say, I want to tell you that, first of all, I need to talk to my girlfriend. You need to meet my girlfriend, married for 61 years. She's sitting right there. That's Helen. I used to call her the most famous lady in the neighborhood because she's an elementary school teacher. And we'd walk around, and she was a substitute in East Lansing. And we'd go out and walk around the neighborhoods at night, and everybody knew Mrs. Ward, all the children, and that was great. She was like a Pied Piper, and still is with young children. And we always liked that. And she was one that held the family together while I did a lot of this other stuff. And I want to mention Tim here. Tim came up to me afterwards. He's Al Jacobs' brother. And Al Jacobs was dean here a long time ago. And Al started at Michigan State, and we were very close friends. And Tim was a good friend and was in East Lansing a lot with us. He's practicing over in Quincy, Illinois. And it's the first time we've seen each other in at least 25 years. And it's just so great to see you. And the long story short with Al Jacobs was that Al was a PhD in anatomy at Michigan State with tremendous interest in sports medicine, and became president of the National Association of Sports Medicine, whatever that's called. And he decided to become a DO once he found out what it was that we do as a profession, and he fell in love with it. At the time, Al was teaching what's called Anatomy 310, which was a university-wide course at Michigan State for anybody who was in the biological sciences or anything remotely attached to biology or to kinesiology. He had the largest single registration every term that he taught that in the whole university in a course, in a science course, because of his methodology with teaching and so forth. He was just a remarkable guy and a very close friend. And he went down to Texas to school, and where my son went to school, my oldest son. And they basically helped open the college down in Texas. And my son, who is a certified neurologist, the oldest son, is the first OMM fellow at the Texas College when he was down there. And he and Ray Morrison, who some of you, if you're in the AOA House of Delegates, you know who Ray Morrison is, because Ray is the speaker of the AOA House of Delegates and has been for many years. And he's the chief of surgery over at the new school in Pittsburgh. So you're developing these relationships right now, because Jay talked about these relationships. You never know where these things are going to go and how your life is going to unfold.
Can I sneak in here real quick?
I told you. I told them I had a quiet voice, so you better be, they're paying attention to me, and that's good. I used to be able to speak loudly, but now that I'm going on 84, my voice has gotten a little bit this way. So if you can't hear me in the back or something, just raise your hand, and I'll do my best as a senior citizen to try to raise it up a little bit. So anyway, I was here in, I had forgotten, I thought I was here prior, and I wasn't sure, but it was 2002, so that was 13 years ago. I came as a Scott Lecher, and excuse me, but at the time, I come from a very politically oriented family. And the family is kind of weird in that sense, because this is a multi-generation thing that goes back to our Canadian roots. And outside of Ottawa, Canada, out in Edmonton, Alberta, and all these people in these previous generations have been active in politics, and my father was very much that way. And so we were involved from the get-go, my brother and me, who I'll tell you about in a minute, were exposed to the highest levels of the AOA from the time we were children. And we would go to Chicago, and we'd go to New York, and we'd do all these things at the highest levels of the AOA, because my father and mother were both involved with the board of directors of the AOA during the California crisis. And that's for me, it's first person singular. During the development of all the hospitals in the profession, which for me is first person singular through my dad, who was chair of the Bureau of Hospitals when the Hill-Burton Act was founded in 1946. And Dad founded the Mount Clemens General Hospital in north of Detroit, which is still and the first level 1 trauma center in the osteopathic profession. And it's still there and going gangbusters north of 20 miles north of Detroit. That's what we practiced. That's what we did. But Dad was a graduate at Des Moines. And he always wanted to treat people because he thought that's what they had to do. And I'm going to talk about this a little further about, well, how did this whole thing evolve? Because the emphasis that I want to make is that we are an entrepreneurial offshoot of 19th century medicine. We're an entrepreneurial offshoot, and we got away with it. We got away with it. And no other group got away with it, but the osteopathic profession did. And the reason we got away with it was that A.T. Still was a skilled politician. And he was, prior to his getting involved with developing the profession, he was over in the Kansas legislature. He developed a university. He had the skill set to start doing that activity over at Baker that he brought with him to Kirksville. He had the skill set for the politics, which he put into play immediately, that he got when he started putting this Kirksville thing together. And I kind of laughed when I saw that sign down in the museum of him as a magnetic healer, because of course that's nutso stuff. And so when I was in Germany teaching a few years ago, Helen and I were walking down the street one Saturday afternoon, and here's this sign somewhere in southern Germany, Heidelberg or someplace, magnetic healer. And this was in the 1980s. People are still doing this stuff in the 1980s. So there's these kind of things that I'm saying about, well, you know, what's going on out there sociologically in the sense of how did we as a profession get into this. Now Jason is sitting back there, Haxton from the museum, and he knows more about this history in some ways than I do, but I think that I told him yesterday that if I hadn't gone into this business, I probably would have gotten a PhD in history, because it was just something that really still fascinates me. So anyway, I have one slide that I failed to include, and I'm going to read this, and it says, 21st Century American Medicine, a diverse, eclectic, interdisciplinary healthcare system which emphasizes high-quality medical education, teaching, research, and public service. Does that sound good? I think it does. I think I can deal with that because I know it's true. In its mission, all aspects of healthcare are represented in a reality-based context. Reality-based context. No hocus pocus. All right, reality-based context that applies osteopathic principles and its current practices, such as they are, to all phases of research, direct patient care, and community health. I'll read that last part. We're working in a reality-based context. When you're running your anatomy, when you're looking at your pathology, when you're looking at your immunology, when you're looking at your epigenetic systems, when you're looking at how they influence and how they work with the atomic systems inside the body and the DNA and this sort of thing, you are going to be privileged to be able to do that where I'm not. Our generation didn't even have immunology in school. Immunology wasn't even invented until 10 years after we were out. So this is how things have changed. Current practices in all phases of research, direct patient care, and community care. So, I spent 46 years in education. Day before yesterday I started, but then it ended up being 46 years, and it went that fast. I can't believe that it went that fast. I saw my very first student from Des Moines rotated with me in 1966. And I've lost track of her, but that was in my office. So when we're done here, those who are interested, I have laid out some artifacts here from the research that I've been involved with in the writing at Michigan State. This is unpublished stuff. So as a result, someone said, why didn't you publish this? Well, it's a long story. But some of this stuff has to do with hands-on care, and I will simply show you one of these things at great distance. When one of my first residents did a very nice cadaveric dissection on an 86-year-old female many years ago in our Department of Anatomy. And what it did was demonstrate to me that the fascia, the way we talk about it, is an interesting metaphor, but it's not scientifically accurate. Okay? Because the issue is we have all of these metaphors that we use to describe what I call things osteopathic. But when you start breaking into the science, where you've got to put numbers on it, and you have to put statistics on it, and this sort of thing, you've got to remember that the huge percentage of the population is over the age of 40, and they're past their primes. And this gives you a good example. And one of the things that I learned was that the fascia, as we talk about it, is simply a big insertion for a lot of muscles. Now, it's got lymphatics, it's got blood vessels, it's got all of these things. But when you break into a fresh specimen on a research basis, like I've done it with the veterinary school and this sort of thing, you get a different view of that whole thing in that sense. And I didn't bring any of those slides because we simply don't have time to talk about them. But this is a real thing. This is what you see in the anatomy lab. So are you working in the anatomy lab right now? So take a look. All you first years, here are pictures, including photomicrographs from electron microscopy that's been done in our department, showing you what fascia really looks like. Not just a metaphoric fascia, but a fascia that has to do with down deep in the system, where you see the collagen viscoelastic systems all working together. And we even have some skin slides here showing what happens to fetal pigs and this sort of thing when you put a biomechanical load on them, and showing what happens when you simply deform the skin and this sort of thing. And then we talked with the CME people a bit about this morning, but I much prefer to talk with you folks because you're not spoiled by too much knowledge. Because the issue is that if you take a systematic science approach, and I'll ask us the same thing here. If I had a second PhD, I would get a PhD in zoology. Anybody a zoology major here besides me? Okay. So not very much. Put your hands up high, because this is the basis for understanding so much in nature. Would you agree as a zoology major? Oh my gosh, only 3 hands went up. What did you take I'm not going to ask you, but what did you take your major in? Because this is what you're going to be doing in operating rooms. This is what you're going to be doing in the ER. This is the stuff that you're going to be doing in the office when you're taking care of wounds and this sort of thing. And the sooner you get a notion of how these different layers, if you're going to become a plastic surgeon, a neurological surgeon, Whatever you choose to become, you've got to pay attention to this kind of things that we learned in comparative anatomy and this sort of thing as an undergraduate zoology major. So now we're going to talk about entrepreneurial activity and a way to define the osteopathic profession as an entrepreneurial profession. The definition of an entrepreneur I got directly from the director of entrepreneurial activity at Michigan State University, who's got a big bucks tenured position, interdisciplinary at Michigan State. And he works across the whole university, and for those of you who don't know Michigan State, we won a football game last Saturday. And they just, NFL.com just said that it's the number one play in the history of all of football. And I can understand why it was. But anyway, here's how you define an entrepreneur. And all of you in this room are entrepreneurs. I know that because you're sitting here today. I know that. First of all, it's teamwork and the ability to work as a team. If you're a solo guy, you're not going to function very well as an entrepreneur. And that's how people actually choose specialties, because their teams are introverted teams, computer geek type teams. But you've got to have teamwork. But the extroverts also have to have teamwork too. So then you have to have the skills to do project management. A.T. Still was a master at both of these, developing teams and project management. That's what we did with the Osteopathic Principles Education Project. They told us we couldn't do that, nobody would support it, and they all did. 9 of the 11 schools financed it at that time. There were 11 schools. And we did this Osteopathic Principles Education Project for 3 years. The other is persuasion. Well, persuasion has to do with persistence. You cannot persuade somebody unless you're persistent. And people and communications and sales are actually taught that. And the persistence and persuasion and being credible in your ability to persuade people, you're going to be persuading patients that you're sharp and you know what you're talking about. And that's a part of the entrepreneurial aspects of what we're talking about. The next one is the ability to exercise appropriate judgment. Not judgment per se, but appropriate judgment for the circumstances in which you're operating. And so that means that in the cases of where you know what's going on and this sort of thing, you may not really know what's going on, and you have to exercise judgment in the sense of how you apply what you're doing. That in turn is a part of dealing with ambiguity. That's called differential diagnosis. That's called differential diagnosis, for example. The next part is courage. I know you're all courageous because you're sitting here. You look around at your peers and they're all out making money or doing something else. And you're sitting here as a student and you're wondering whether or not I've made the right choice. And I've had medical students tell me in the second year, usually it is, you know, I made a bad choice. It wasn't very many because we've had thousands of students over the 46 years I've been, but I've had a few do that. And they're smart to get out because they just get overwhelmed by everything and they know they've not made the right choice. And the third is the ambiguity business that or the last one is the ambiguity business I've talked about. So among the issues that I think that you need to understand if you're dealing with these kind of things, that change is the only constant. And if you're not ready to deal with change and that you think you're going to lock yourself into doing something in this sort of thing, that change will get in the way of progress for yourself, okay? Now, the political aspect of the osteopathic profession is an interesting conundrum because still got away with murder. Jason's laughing. I think he knows what I'm talking about. He really did. This guy was a master at 19th century metaphor at writing about what he thought things ought to be and how he ought to do it, and he had a very nice personality for the most part. He was a pretty neat guy. People really took to him. He had a big practice. He came from an upper middle class background by our standards, it sounds like, but then he lost everything and then he had to rebuild it. But that's what happened to him. Down in Virginia, they were pretty well off, and then they lost everything during the war and this sort of thing. And then he had a military experience. Well, you can say what you like about the military, but the military is saving this profession as we sit here. Because 3 or 4 of the major deans in the major schools right now are ex-military people. And the dean at Michigan State has been there 12 or 13 years now, Bill Strample. And he was number 2, the second ranking medical officer in the Pentagon for a long time. And the name's gone now, but his immediate boss was also a DO. And he was a president at Texas, and then the guy before him was from Michigan State, and he was a general in the Air Force. So the discipline of being in the military has helped our profession, and it's a piece of serendipity in that sense. But Still himself also had military experience, and doesn't matter what kind of experience it was, but the issue is that he had this attachment to what was going on from the standpoint of the evolution of his own behavior, and he, of course, probably didn't realize it or never talked about it, except maybe in hindsight, okay? So anyway, he was one heck of a politician. And he, very early on, his people started wanting to leave, and where did they go? They went all over the world, but in the first 5 years, a bunch of them went to California. They ultimately created a huge problem for the profession. They were the first ones to have hospital privileges in the profession outside of Missouri. And they connected with the Los Angeles County Hospital way early in the 20th century. And I don't remember the year, but it was like before 1910. And they was there as the first official ones. And then I lived through the California crisis. When my dad was president of the AOA in 1965, and he and that group, and my dad was chairman of the Bureau of Hospitals, they were handling all of this crisis out in California that we simply don't have time to talk about in any kind of detail. But that, for me, once again, is the first person singular. We have what I call phases. And has anyone ever read Malcolm Gladwell's stuff? Okay, I'm going to talk about Malcolm Gladwell a little bit, because Malcolm Gladwell is another Canadian who, I know we have some Canadians with us today, thank God. There's some sane people in the room. Malcolm Gladwell is from Toronto, and he writes for the New Yorker magazine, I believe it is. And he's written some amazing books, and I recommend all of his books to all of you as you go through and as you learn to be doctors, because he has this set of insights with examples that tells you how things will unfold as you begin to deal with your life and all the ambiguities of life. And one of his books talks about inflection points. Have you ever heard of inflection points in your psychology and sociology courses? We're at an inflection point in the profession right now. I hope we're not at a tipping point. And there is an essential point to be made between a tipping point and an inflection point. The inflection point implies that a group will change, or a individual or a marriage or any other kind of situation that you confront will somehow dramatically change the direction of one's life or one's views on this sort of thing. You people are at an inflection point in the first year, because you're not quite sure. You know you want to be here, but you're not sure what the future holds. And for sure, I don't know, and that's for sure Jay doesn't know, because we have all of these inflection points occurring with medical records and the government and the insurance things and that sort of thing. Those inflection points are multiple. And so we've had a lot of success dealing with these over the years. The first inflection started when Still, in 1874, started his entrepreneurial activity for developing the osteopathic profession. That went on until he started the college here, at the ASO and the schools here. That went on for a period of time. To give you a sense of context, because context is one of my other favorite terms, is that I want to know the context of your life when you talk to me or when we share. I want to know the context of your life as a patient, as a physician, my experience and this sort of thing. I want to know the context of this whole group because you have a different personality as a group than the second years do. Have you figured that out yet? Your whole class? The chemistry of your class is different. And if you haven't figured it out, I can tell you your faculty is fast figuring it out. Because every class has a different social personality. And I've seen it many, many times over the years. And so these inflection points are contingent upon who you are in what group at any particular time. And these inflection points have, luckily, I guess, I hope I've used the right word, will have been a central core of the osteopathic profession from the get-go. Now the reason for that is that Still was iron-handed in what he did. He felt very strongly about everything that he did. And anybody deviated from what he was going to do, they heard about it. Now the famous ones are, he didn't like drugs and he didn't like vaccinations, and what's the third one?
Only drinking.
Yeah, well, there's a good reason he didn't like people drinking. Well, there's a reason for that, and he never talked about it, which is kind of interesting. But alcoholism per capita was much greater when he was in the 19th century. Substance abuse in the 19th and early 20th century per capita was higher than it is today. Per capita. My grandfather was a pharmacist. What did he make? Mortar and pestle. He made all kinds of narcotics, opium-based drugs, laudanum, and this sort of thing over in Kingston, Ontario, where he had his drugstore. No problem. They had Lydia Pinkham's compound that they used, and all the women in the Women's Christian Temperance Union that didn't want to drink alcohol, they drank Lydia Pinkham's because it was 80% alcohol. They didn't know it was 80% alcohol, but they liked it. It was that kind of stuff that we're talking about. And A.T. Still knew that, and he had been dealing with that kind of thing. So the issue then is, why was he against vaccinations? The science hadn't really gotten very far at that point, because the Golgi tendon apparatus, have you had the Golgi tendon apparatus in your neurosciences yet in class? Because A.T. Still and the people that taught physiology when I was around, they used to talk about the muscle and the Golgi tendon system. It wasn't even discovered until the late 19th century. And this was when A.T. Still was starting this school. He didn't know about that stuff and this kind of thing. And there was this ambiguous vacuum of information. And so he said, okay, I'm just not going to deal with it. Because he had this whole other aspect of medicine that he wanted to talk about, and it's very vast and it's very eclectic right from the get-go. So the first stage and first phase of what we have that we're talking about, and I'm talking about 4 or maybe 5 phases, is that the first phase went on until 1910. What happened in 1910? The Flexner Report. The Flexner Report was released in 1910, and the Harrison Narcotics Act was released in 1913. And they played, that's when all this pharmacology discussion that A.T. Still didn't like really came into focus because of the changes in the laws and this sort of thing. These are inflection points historically. And over 50% of all the medical schools in the country shut down at the time that Abraham Flexner made this report, and it's a great big report. And there is an AT Still type of museum at the University of Louisville in honor of Abraham Flexner, excuse me, University of Kentucky in Louisville. So anybody here from Kentucky? Okay, so go over to Kentucky and you can see what Abraham Flexner did in the sense of completely changing, that's the inflection point that I'm talking about. He completely changed the practice of medicine because they said you can't have a medical school unless you teach science. Now, they weren't real clear at that point about what science was, but it wasn't too much of a reach for most of the people who survived. But we had a whole boatload of osteopathic storefront operations that disappeared right on the spot, and as well they should have. And so that changed everything at the time. So then, after Flexner, there was this, and at that time, we had these new schools were starting to develop because Chicago was in place, Des Moines was in place by 1910, Philadelphia was in place by 1910, and what am I missing? Kirksville, of course. There were 5 schools in place. So Kansas City wasn't in place until 1916, so they were not affected.
California.
Oh, Los Angeles, yes, Los Angeles. And so anyway, these 5 schools survived this whole thing. And this is when my personal thoughts, after all these years, is that this profession became a metropolitan profession. And it went to large population centers and survived on the basis of being in large population centers like Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Detroit, and Chicago, and this sort of thing, and that saved them, and nobody ever noticed. Nobody noticed. But there was a lot of discussion in the profession about the profession from the standpoint of, well, we have AT Still out here in rural Missouri who kick-started this whole thing, but then we have this whole other process that happened after Flexner, and New York got involved eventually. I mean, all the really, really big metropolitan centers, and then you started to have this growth. Now, the growth was very slow to start with. It's kind of like the sperm hitting the egg, and then you have the gamete, and then you have the gastrula and the blastula, and I hope you all know what that is, and this sort of thing. And so it starts to grow, and then all of a sudden, exponentially, boom, you got this whole corpus of what's going on in the process, and the profession begins to grow. Well, duh. You've got all these docs that are providing services in these big cities. And then you get all this feedback from osteopathically trained doctors from their patients. They said, what are you doing that's so different and is so useful? So useful in the way that they're being taught. The problem with that is that every school was teaching something different. So I go to ECOP. I go to the second meeting of ECOP in 1969 at the Michigan College of Osteopathic Medicine. We had 25 students in a private school, doomed. But ECOP came over there. And so in the process, when we had people coming in from these other schools, long story short, I'm getting feedback.
It's okay, keep going.
Okay. Long story short, everybody was a miracle worker. Philadelphia, oh yeah, I'm the best. Chicago, oh yeah, we're really good. We have all of these people who are really very good. Some are doing sports medicine, they're doing professional sports teams, and they are good. There's no question about it. But when you ask them about what they're teaching osteopathically and this sort of thing, and there's no agreement. Zero agreement. And I'm thinking, what is that about? They didn't even have a common language. There was no common language. And they didn't know what, they didn't even maybe think it was important at that point. Now, mind you, that's a long time ago, isn't it? But I was there. And because we were starting a new school, and we had to have something to work with. So we worked with the Kirksville manual, and we worked with the Chicago manual, and did the best we could, because we were all graduates of different schools, and we worked with different languages. We had different tones to what we were talking about. So anyway, that's when I became convinced that if this was going to work, we had to make some changes. And at that point, I became a part of the Office of Medical Education, Research and Development at Michigan State. After I did my first job as family practice, family medicine chair, I did that for 14 months. But for the next 7 years, we spent our time working on the Osteopathic Principles Education Project. And the whole thing developed from there, along with the OPTEs, the OPTEs and all of that were spin-offs of all of that kind of thing that were happening. Those are more inflection points that were happening at that time. So when I was a student, in the middle 1950s, our class was about half the size of this group. I was a junior student, and the AMA showed up at our front door. And they were writing regularly about what a terrible bunch of people these osteopaths were. And you could read it quite regularly in the Journal of the American Medical Association. And so they decided that this group would get together, and they would have a 5-person panel visit as many osteopathic schools as they could, and they went to 4 of us, and Kansas City happened to be one, and I happened to be one of 3 people chosen from my school to appear before this committee of the AMA in 1955. And what happened was, they were a neat bunch of guys. I mean, we all had a very cordial discussion, and they asked me to do a physical and a history, such as it was done at that time, and this sort of thing. And they went around and they said, oh, these people really seem to know what they're talking about, but they're what they call a Class B medical school. Well, we didn't have any facilities to amount to hill of beans in Kansas City at the time, but we did have a big OB department and a good basic science department, but we didn't have facilities like the medical school did. So the long story short was, tipping point, the AMA was trying to get rid of the word cult out of the osteopathic language. And they said, oh no, we're not going to do that. There's still a bunch of cult people, because they talk in magic terms. And that didn't really get cleared up for about another 10 years after that. So from 1916 until 1969, there was no college development in this profession. That's a long time. That's 53 years took place. There was nothing happened. Well, that's not really true. But the issue is, everybody had kind of hunkered down in the process, and they were busy getting licensure activities going on, and my father was deeply involved with that, and getting licensure among the different states. They were deeply involved because of discrimination in hospital privileges, and so he built his own hospital with 5 other guys, 500 or 600 guys over in Mount Clemens, and it still is one of the biggest osteopathic training programs in the country, over at the Mount Clemens Hospital there in Michigan. It's a part of the Michigan State Network. And so he opened this 44-bed hospital in Mount Clemens with these guys, and now it's about a 350-bed multidisciplinary level 1 trauma center. And so that was a part of what happened, but the only reason that happened was in 1944 and 1946 as the Hill-Burton Act passed. Anybody besides me and a few others ever heard of the Hill-Burton Act? Because that's why you're here. Well, the Hill-Burton Act was passed by the federal government, kind of like Obamacare got passed, and this sort of thing. Is a hugely important program for hospital construction after World War II. And in the process, Dad and his group put together a 44-bed hospital, but the smartest thing they did was buy a lot of property. Still did the same thing. He bought up half of Kirksville, didn't he? And they had all of this area to expand and this sort of thing. So in the process, what happened was that they the AOA, and they were busy dealing with the internal, what I call clan-related politics of all the various parts of the professions, because the big cities developed clans, just like your family. You have your clan, and you've got the Philadelphia clan, you've got the New York clan, you've got the Michigan State clan, you've got the Kirksville clan, and they're all good folks doing good things, but they think about the world through a different set of prisms quite often. And this is what was going on at this time. We couldn't get into other states and this sort of thing. A lot of that was going on, and that went on way into the 1960s. So during this period of time, we had this disjunction that occurred between the state of Illinois and the state of Michigan. Because Michigan didn't have any DOs in the state when this law was passed, when this practice law was passed. Illinois, for some reason, wasn't able to get a full practice act. And I don't know that history well enough to share it with you. But Illinois didn't have a full practice act in the sense of being able to do what osteopathic physicians were trained to do, so a boatload of them came over to Michigan. We had a boatload of people from Kirksville came to Michigan too. And so that's how this tipping point, this inflection point, was affected by legislation in the state of Illinois that sent these people to the adjacent state over there. The reason that we grew so much is the hospitals started to expand. What do you want to do? You want to work in a hospital. My dad was the chairman of the Bureau of Hospitals, and that was his life at the AOA. That's what they ran, and they were running the Bureau of Hospitals out of California and all of this kind of thing. So that was what was happening over that long period of 53 years as there were no new schools that were coming on, because 100% of all of the DOs in Michigan and across the country were trained in private schools. They weren't trained in public schools. The first money that came into the profession for from the states was at Philadelphia. And there was a smallish state subsidy went into Philadelphia back in the 60s, and then it kind of began growing like Topsy at that point. And we were the second biggest one, and now our institution is a major player in Division I education right now. But all of that had to do with with this development of hospitals. Now, the foothold that we have in the hospitals has changed completely. When I went into Lansing, Michigan, we couldn't go in hospitals, and they wouldn't accept us. And I was, what is this about? I've got a medical school that we're trying to run, and the local hospitals won't even let us talk to them. And well, that all changed. Now, over half of the staffs of the two major hospitals in town are DOs, and the departments are run by DOs. The first continuing medical education courses in what I call Mainline Medicine occurred at the University of Michigan and Wayne State in Michigan. And I took courses. I took a 3-year continuing education course in psychiatry when I was in private practice. And then we did internal medicine over at the University of Michigan every fall. But that was very early. That was in the late 50s and early 60s when that was getting started. Well, by the time it came time that people said, we need to have our own school, it was getting into the mid-60s, and we're going into another phase, an inflection phase, because the DOs in Michigan decided that they would tax themselves $200 a head, and there were about 1,700 people. Can you imagine? Well, we're going to start a school, and we're going to charge you just $200 a year to start a school. Even in those days, that was crazy. And so in the process, what we did, developed the Michigan College of Osteopathic Medicine, but it was gone in 2 years. And we had friends in the legislature that got us to go over to Michigan State at that time, and the rest is history there. But the story is that we have these series of phases and inflection points that really are kind of interesting to look at if you look at it in that context. Now, by 1974, what happened was the return to rural education in the profession. And in 1974 is when West Virginia opened. And I was down there before the school was even getting going. So over here we had Michigan State with 1,700 DOs in the state, and West Virginia down here we had less than 20. Well, how can you start a medical school with 20 students or 20 people in the state? And they did it because Bob Sharp was plugged into the federal government through his state senator. And they got the IRS processing center. It's right there outside of Lewisburg in West Virginia. Greenbrier, one of the most famous resorts in the world, is right there. And there's big money there hiding all around those hills of West Virginia. And that's how the West Virginia program got started. And some of us went down there to help them get started. And I worked with them for several years before we did that. So now, in the last phase, what we've gotten into is this explosion of new schools. And we went through this syndrome, these inflection points with all of these things going on during my career. And we used to sit around when these new schools were open. We were consulting at Ohio, getting the Ohio school underway. Now, what did they just announce? You know what they just announced, the Ohio school? Their new affiliation? They're with the Cleveland Clinic. Can you believe that? They've just officially affiliated and will be training students for DO degree in Cleveland at the Cleveland Clinic. And so this is how far things have come just in my lifetime. First person singular. And there's just all kinds of stories that haven't been told because what I say, we've got to take the glasses off and start paying attention to some of this stuff. So the issue then for me is, what are we going to do in the future? And you're going to tell us, because I'm not going to tell you. Ambiguity reigns. People are complaining bitterly about the electronic health record, and we were working with that 20 years ago, and it was a pile of you-know-what at that time. And it's only gotten worse. They just came out with the DSM-10. How many of you know what the DSM-10 is? Okay, most of you don't. The DSM-10 is the new coding system for the electronic health record. 68,000 diagnoses. They started out with about 15 in DSM-9. Now they're up to 68,000. And some of the craziest stuff you ever read in your life is in that system. So good luck, folks. That's the future of medicine, because we talked about it a little bit this morning as I wind this down. And the issue is that what we have to fight for, and I don't know how it's going to happen, is the ability to continue to work with the patient and not objectify the patient. Because that is a major, major problem. And one of the major things that happens with physician-patient interactions is the tendency not to touch the patient, and the other is to objectify the patient rather than hear their story so you can really understand. And any experienced physician in this room knows exactly what I'm talking about. Until you can find out what's going on with these patients, have them tell you your story, shut your mouth, listen. Shut your mouth, listen. Ask a question, shut your mouth, listen. And that is the whole thing about what patient care is about, as far as I was trained and I would practice for 53 years. I told the people this morning, I did a little math earlier about how many patients I'm pretty sure that I saw over a period, patient contacts I saw over a period of years, 40,000. 40,000 patient contacts. That's the kind of thing you're probably looking at. So when you're studying in there, you're going to be interacting with all of these people. At Michigan State, I've interacted with third world people, Russia, all kinds of ethnic groups. I could tell you war stories about so many different things, about the different types of patients we've had and so forth. Ask the questions and shut up and listen. Because a lot of the stuff you won't understand because so much of it is culturally determined. How patients report their symptoms are culturally determined. We talked about that a little this morning. And then, once you have a clear notion of what's going on, then you start touching the patient. And then you start saying, well, isn't that interesting? This is a biomechanical ERS, FRS, right, or whatever it is, and this sort of thing. And you lose track of the notion that this is a patient with the problem. And so in between. There's flex time in between. So in closing, I want to thank Fred and Janet Tinning for the opportunity to be here for the second time. I'm not sure that he understood that when he did it, but when he approved this. But Fred and I worked together at Michigan State when they opened on the campus of MSU, and Janet and their daughter, I see her name is on here too. She is one of my patients and one of my residents. And so I'm very grateful that Fred and Janet have seen clear to do this kind of thing. And it's just such a joy to see Tim Jacobs here, and brings back family memories from way back, and they're all good memories with his brother Al. So thank you very much for inviting me, and if you want to take 5 minutes or ask me some questions, and I'll just hold Jay at arm's length. Does anybody want to ask a question or two? Or are you all asleep? Yeah, okay, that's all right. Good. Well, it's been a joy being here with you, and Helen and I have really appreciated the time down here, and tomorrow we head down for a couple of days at Branson. Thank you very much.
For just a second. Dr. Ward, we've got this very fancy plaque for you for the Tinning Founders Day Osteopathy Lecture, October 22nd, 2015, presented to you from ATSU University. Thank you again for coming and introducing, because when we talk about history, I know that very few people probably enjoyed this as much as Jason probably, and there's probably a few people who did, but because his story is our story. His story is our story. I mean, my story is actually your story, and your story is mine. So it's really neat to see, we're all living in history. We're living in momentous times. And Dr. Ward said it brilliantly. Thank you so much again for teaching me.
Thank you.